Janine, sorry, I know I'm up next. Unfortunately, you were on mute in the intro.
Apologies, everyone. Sorry, I was on mute. I wanted to introduce you to everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the 8th TDI webinar, focusing on future transport zones. Today, we'll be joined by 4 fantastic speakers who will be sharing their journeys on the future transport zones for you. I will be sharing the presentation deck and the recording after the webinar, so please don't worry if you miss out. We do have a question and answer session at the end where our speakers will be able to answer any of your questions coming through. If you want to have a question, then just pop it into the speech bubble with a question mark in the top right hand of your corner and we will get them answered. However, if we don't get all questions answered today, our speakers will endeavour to get them answered for you, and I will be sending them out after the webinar. I will now pass you over to Julia Scarani from the Department of Transport, who will provide an introduction to future transport zones. Hope you enjoy the webinar. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you, Janine, and welcome everyone to the session today. So I'll give you a brief overview about our future transport zones, or FTZs, and then I'll pass over to 2 of our zones, and then a colleague from Catapult to give you some additional insight. So next slide, please. Thank you. So in 2019, we designed the Future Transport Zone program at the Department for Transport, really with the intention to provide funding to allow areas around the country to trial innovative and cutting-edge transport modes and models. And after a competitive process, a total of £92 million worth of funding was invested in 4 areas. And we had the West Midlands Combined Authority, which functions as a pathfinder for our work, which started in 2019, and it was then followed by 3 other areas, which are Derby and Nottingham, Portsmouth and Southampton as Solent Transport, which will be our next speaker, and then the West Midlands. So the areas that received funding after FTZs are working with innovative businesses as well as local bodies such as hospitals, airports and universities to deliver their projects. So really quite a lot of variety there. And you can see on the slide, but just to name a few, some of the initiatives that we have been supporting through the zones include the trialling of mobility as service, or MAS, which is common around over 4 areas. Various data projects, such as building data hubs in some areas, e-scooter trials, which are live across all of our 4 areas as well. And then other ad hoc initiatives such as dynamic demand responsive transport, mobility credits. And finally, we also have a common theme around delivery and logistics. So some of the interventions that we'll see happen include e-cargo bikes, delivery consolidation, and the use of drones for logistics, which you will hear more about in a moment from our NHS deliveries to the Isle of Wight. So in launching the zones here at DFT, we're really interested in understand how well individual schemes have worked, as well as understanding how these schemes work together and the cumulative impacts they might have. So both success and failure will work for us in kind of like learning lessons from these trials. And we're obviously hoping to inform future policy making in these areas. So next slide, please. So as you will imagine, data does play a huge part in how we deliver and understand our future transport zones. So good data collection and availability underpins a lot of the programs that have been funded. You know, mentioning MAS as one, transport data, transport hubs, to name a few. So for instance, in Nottingham, which is one of our zones which is not here today, we have been trialling a smart vehicle monitoring system using Vivacity Lab cameras. So FTZ funding, as I said, has innovation evidence gathering at its core. And a key criteria of success for us will be to understand the factors that contributed to the intervention success or lack of success indeed, how we can adapt things when they're not working, both during the trials as well as in the future when some of these projects might happen in other parts of the country. And when things don't go so well, what conditions could the intervention work under? So my last point on data is that each of the areas is undertaking their local evaluation to really understand how our intervention work, and this is done either internally by teams or often with the support from local academics and consultants. As the Department for Transport, to help us make sense of all of the evidence that will be gathered through the zones, and also to ensure that we think about this with a really impartial eye, we have also got a national evaluation that is delivered externally by NatSen, and it will cover the entire 4 years of the programme. As you can imagine, and as you'll hear, getting started both on some of these projects and the evaluation itself has not been free of challenge due to the events of the past year. But we are now in the evaluation particularly working to understand, together with our zones and suppliers, how to best undertake baseline data collection. So this was a very quick whistle-stop tour of our zones. I'll pass back to Janine for our next speaker. You're still on mute, Janine.
Thank you very much. That's great. Thanks, Julia. I'll now pass over to our next speaker, Conrad Hay, who's our transport manager from Solent Transport. So welcome, Conrad, and I'm looking forward to your presentation.
Good morning. Thank you, Julia and Janine. Next slide, please, if we could. I'm Conrad Haig. I'm Solent Transport Manager, as sort of Janine's just told you. Yes, next one, if you could. And I'm going to be talking about experimental flights for the NHS. Just to give you a bit of an understanding of who Solent are, because not everybody does know who we are. We are a transport partnership between Southampton, Portsmouth, Hampshire and the Isle of Wight. And this is give you a rough idea of our geographical area. And to give you some idea of what that means, we are around 20% of the TFSE, Transport for the South East population. And whilst we're quite a slim piece of land, it's very densely populated. So comparable populations to sort of the cities of Copenhagen, Oslo, Dublin. You can see the list. I'm not going to go through them all. But we also have travel patterns within this section, within the area, which is why the partnership was formed, that really focus our minds on how people travel between these major cities and the island. And so it's quite key in making sure that cross-border working really happens. So Isle of Wight was originally only involved in the drones trial, but is now fully involved in the FTZ, including the scooters. And yeah, could I have the next slide, please? Just a quick overview of what our project is. So we have a number of projects within the programme, and theme one is personal mobility, and I won't go through that long list there, but it's all held together with the delivery of a MAS, Mobility as a Service app. Theme two is more on logistics, and we've got both macro and micro logistics for freight, and as I'm going to speak about, drone logistics for the NHS, and that's held together with Mobility Hubs, which is a crossover project. So next slide, please. So why drones? And I think it's that's a very valid question, because drones are new technology and very exciting, but it can be a bit of a vanity project. But in the Solent, it really isn't. You can see our geography here, and we're a peninsula an island geography, and we've got big cities with complicated travel routes, and whilst they're not far apart, some of these travel routes can cause quite a lot of issues for logistics and also for patients traveling between NHS sites, and what we can do to try and reduce that can really help the NHS, but also the quality of life for our residents and this quality of service they're getting through the health service. So can I have the next slide, please? So here's an example. So these are all the medical surgeries that take pathology in the Solent, and this is the level of deliveries that they get. Either to this is for Southampton Hospital, it's a very similar one for Portsmouth, and you can see that they're actually not that far apart. But when you look at the logistics of getting them from in the peninsula geography, actually anything we can do to improve the delivery of these on time will be a massive improvement. Can we have the next slide, please? I'm starting to feel a little bit like Boris Johnson here. So for instance here, this is a pathology slide. So the blue is when pathology is taken at medical institutes within the Solent area, and the red is when the pathology gets delivered to the hospital to be analysed. And you can see most of the pathology is taken in the morning, and probably about 50% of it by 1 o'clock. But that stuff never actually arrives sort of at anywhere where it can be analysed till about 2-3 o'clock, and the majority of it is coming in after that. Now, whilst a lot of it might not be urgent, and you can schedule it so that the quiet period at the hospital where you can see that there's very little coming in, they can do yesterday's work. Actually, if some of this is urgent, this can really slow down the diagnosis and analysis of people's problems. And we, by flying by drone, can significantly increase the turnaround of this. So we could have most of the pathology in the hospital before midday, 1 o'clock. And that would give us a real opportunity to really speed up by a day or 2 days analysis and sort of understanding what people's issues might be. And if you've got an aggressive cancer or something like that, that could be quite key. Next slide, please. So when the pandemic struck, it came to light to us that actually the island may need a bit of support. The nature of the pandemic was a lot of transport services were reduced, and the ferries to the islands were actually at a very low level. In normal times, you can get quite a big gap in the afternoon, so you can have 2-hour gaps between ferries in the afternoons to get things back onto the mainland. But during the pandemic, the gaps were much bigger and the ferries were much less frequent. So it was a really big issue for them. So we decided to try and work with the NHS and with the DFT. And I have to put a personal thanks in to the DFT on this, because the DFT and particularly even the Secretary of State was incredibly helpful at working with this, helping us work with the CAA to get permissions to do this. And a big thank you. Went way beyond the call of duty on that one. So we asked St Mary's if we could assist. Now, as it happened, and I'm going to be very honest with you, a lot of the things that we were able to carry for them were actually carried on freight going between the islands, and it worked okay. But it was a very big relief to them to know that they had the backup of the drone service should it be required. So what was required to do this? Well, it wasn't simple by any stretch of the imagination. I've mentioned permissions from the CAA, and I think we only got those because of the DFT and the Secretary of State, I'll be honest. There's quite a lot of technical work on what we call the technical danger area, which is an area that allows drones to fly at the same time as normal manned flights. Approval to carry benign cargoes. This was great, and it was a massive step forward for the drones logistics, but I have to say not being able to carry categorized cargoes was an issue that came up later on. Liaison between the airfields, because we were using quite a big drone that needed airfields, and the logistics, because to satisfy the CAA's requirement for safety, we had to have pilots at each side of the trip, both on the island and on the mainland, even though the drone was quite capable of landing and taking off on its own. So this was a bit of a logistical problem. And Believer flights, so Believer is a much lighter drone. We did a lot of testing with Believer to make sure that the Ultra, which is a very large vehicle, could do this flight and have no problems. And then finally, something that we found out was the land logistics required between the two airfields was problematic. That all said, massive step forward for drone logistics. Massive step forward for us. The NHS were very pleased about having the backup, and we and the NHS were both very pleased that we managed to break, I think it's 5 aviation firsts in the UK. First point-to-point flight. And BVLOS stands for Beyond Visual Line of Sight. So this was the first drone flights in the UK to actually go beyond what you could see, and it really opened the door for lots of things that came after. So you may have heard of the stuff that was done on the Isle of Scillies and in Scotland. All of this was made possible because of the breakthroughs that we managed to make, and they have built on the work that we've done, and we are trying to build on the work that they've done, and some of our friends in the Catapult and other people who are looking at drone flights. So could we sort of move on to the next slide? So this is the vehicle we were using, and it's quite big. It's the size of a small plane, a small single-man plane. Its original design was for carrying cargoes in Africa, and it needs a runway, a reasonable sized proper runway to fly. So if we can go to the next slide, you'll get a feel of the cargo hold. So that cargo hold is about the size of an estate car. It will carry that sort of level of cargoes, and those are the sort of boxes that we're into carry. But what we did learn quite quickly is actually one of the things that the NHS really needs from a drone flight is not the big movements, but we weren't to know that when we asked for help from wind racers to do this. But it's actually the small movements of time sensitive and sometimes quite complex cargoes. So patient diagnostics, I've mentioned aseptic medicines, which are to do with cancer and can only be mixed up and delivered to the patient within 7 hours and can only be mixed up on the mainland. So small drone point-to-point drones that we think, having done a lot of this, will be more appropriate to the NHS. Emergency blood movements. Now, when we started this, we assumed we would be able to carry blood because it's not a categorized cargo, but it turns out it has to be carried as a categorized cargo, so this wasn't possible either. So mainly what we were able to carry were things like PPE and sort of medical things like that, sort of cargoes that weren't of a categorized nature. So lessons learned from the COVID response. Most drones, and this is going to sound rather silly, are designed because someone can design one. They want to make a drone, and they're not necessarily made with something in mind. And a lot of them are unsuitable for the movement of medical cargoes and for the nature of the work that is required. The other thing we found out, and I've mentioned this a few times now, is the dangerous goods. Now, I'm sure that all of you on this call know that dangerous goods covers a multiple of things, from party poppers and air sprays to nuclear waste. But a lot of things are categorized in this area, and a lot of the NHS cargoes are. So getting that approval is absolutely key. And the most effective type of drones are probably not large drones, but quite small drones that can carry can quickly carry site-to-site cargoes. The other thing we realized is that logistically this was a bit of a nightmare, and to make it really work we needed full automation via air traffic control, which is something that was in our plan anyway, but it really emphasized the need. So our next steps were really to sort of get DG approval and accept it, get greater understanding of the needs of the medical carriage for chemotherapy, etc., from the hospital on the island. Can I have the next slide, please? So on the positive side, this really was a massive boost for the publicity of the drones work, not just on our project, but on others. And I think it provided a real springboard for new work that's been going on. It was very positively covered in the media, and we had a lot of press, and it really gave us a good understanding and of what we need to do. So what we did is we rewrote the entire program based on what we'd learned, and I think it was really great to have this trial to be able to do that. Can I have the next slide, please? So our next set of trials are in August, September this year. This is the drone we will be using. It's apparently called a Mugging V44. It's not a great name in my opinion, but there you are. It's a vertical takeoff. It's got a wing as well, because the winds in the Solent can be a little bit treacherous, and it can carry quite small light cargoes. It will be able to take off between the two hospitals using the helicopter landing pads, and that's great, because the other alternative when things are really urgent on the island, particularly during lockdown, was to send the rescue up helicopter, and that's one, needed elsewhere, and two, very expensive. So as I've said, we've rewritten the entire program to really take on board all the lessons learned, and it was such a valuable experience doing this project. But we will be trialing this drone. We'll be doing a minimum of 30 flights during sort of September, August to a 3-month period, and we will probably be using mainly redundant chemotherapy at this point, just to check that this new vehicle it can carry this, and there can be no worries for the NHS about the assurance of that. So we're currently just finalising this, and we haven't yet made the announcement because it's still sort of been absolutely pinned down. But this is very likely to go ahead in late August, early September. We've also, the university who are working with us, and I have to say that the University of Southampton are absolutely key to this project, and as are the University of Portsmouth, are helping us with some engagement with the stakeholders. So people get quite worried about when you say drone carriage. So we just really wanted to make sure that they're on board and understand what that means. So we've got an augmented reality headset that can visualize how little disturbance these vehicles will make to the environment, and that really is a sort of a key to keeping everybody on board and making people happy about what we're trying to do with this. And that's really the key element of it, I think. Sort of I think if next slide, I think we're fairly, I think that covers most of it, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Conrad. That was really interesting and fascinating with the size of the actual drone itself, because for me that's never really been a part of the drone environment. You certainly think a drone being quite small, so it's very exciting, very innovative, so really looking forward to seeing where you go with that. So our next speaker now is Mark Collins. He's the Innovation Integration Lead from Transport of West Midlands, and I will send him across now. Thank you.
Thanks, Janine. Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Collins. If we're able to go to the next slide. Super. Yeah, so as sort of Julia has suggested, we're going to go through a sort of whistle-stop tour of the West Midlands Future Mobility Zone, and specifically look at one of the showcase elements that we have in the programme around the University of Warwick. Next slide. So I won't dwell on this, but as a Pathfinder programme, we've been at this now for about 2 years. COVID in between just provided some interesting challenges and some disruption to the programme, but as you'll see, we've sort of managed that as we've gone on. If we can go to the next slide, please. So just a bit of a summary as to why we're sort of running this programme. I think regionally we've got some interesting challenges around specifically car use and our sort of high dependency on car use. And we recognise that ultimately the way that we choose to travel and move goods is relatively unsustainable. We have to do something about that. A lot of that is about behaviour as well as sort of the enablement of that behaviour. So really what we're trying to do as part of this programme is help people, really empower them and enable them to make those sustainable travel choices. So everything that we do sort of links back to that same message about trying to embed that sort of behaviour change. And one of the sort of the key principles of what we're trying to do is, and the allowance of the programme, is to really trial different things, understand what influence that has across different variables, both those of the environment, those of the sort of economic impact, and also those within the social environment as well, and to assess whether actually that gives us a better balance of those variables, you know, and sort of compare that to where we are with sort of our reliance on car usership. Next slide, please. So this slide tries to summarise the components that we have within the programme. Unfortunately, no drones in this one, but what we've got here is a mix of a really detailed customer, i.e. population analysis. What do people sort of view as important towards transport? What are their sort of views on future transport elements as well? So we've got some tools that we've been using to segment that population and also talk to that population quite actively to try and get a dialogue going about, well, what's important to them, why do they travel, etc. And then we've got a number of different elements that are looking at either incentivizing the population to try something different or enabling them to do something different too. So mobility credits is about giving people credit for a scrapped vehicle and only allowing them to use certain services. How do they behave? What services do they use, etc. We've got a big piece of work around different modes, so everything from e-scooters to man-responsive transport, bike share schemes, etc. Really trying to get under the skin of trying to expand that sort of modal choice of people. Linked to that is our work on mobility hubs. So this is about what happens if you aggregate elements of chiefly micro-mobility in locations. What value does that give to those local populations? And then data plays a key part of this, not only data for the local authorities, but also data in terms of giving people the information when they need it at an appropriate time. And that links quite neatly to our mobility to service program that we're looking to sort of install as well, and some key linkages there into 5G. And ultimately what we're trying to do with this part of the program is if we can understand people's preferences and understand what sort of incentivizes them to change to a sustainable mode of behavior, ultimately that's a really transferable element for us, and we can scale that insight across the region. So next slide, please. So going to the University of Warwick, and why we've picked them as a partner, it's important really to understand that £22 million is quite a lot, but actually in transport terms isn't massively significant. So what we've looked to do is concentrate our efforts in small locations whereby we can monitor a population when something changes. We can understand why that's changed and sort of the relative impact on the local sort of ecosystem of transport. So University of Warwick, who sort of share a similar ethos to us around modality and also this sustainable behaviour, are working with us to implement a number of different things, and we've tried to explain these on this slide. So we're looking at existing services. What can we do to make them more attractive? So that's everything from things that I'll explain in a moment around amplifying the experience on those modes of transport, making them more frequent, etc., making them more accessible. And then we've got additional services. So i.e. how do we expand the choice of what is available to a given individual? So this is where we've got things like e-scooters, demand-responsive transport, car club, lift sharing, etc., all concentrated within a small geography. Mobility as a service plays a part in that, because actually if you can aggregate all those modes together in one location digitally, then it means that therefore in theory you've got more access for more people. And then linked to those, as I said, are what changes in infrastructure required. How do you amplify the experience for people to make it more valuable for them? And then you've got the other elements around incentives and disincentives. And effectively what we've got here is a set of ingredients, and what we're trying to do is for any given individual is work out what is the recipe for success that enables them to then take a different mode to their current car sort of predisposition. Next slide, please. So just touching quickly upon some of these experience amplifiers. Normally in transport sense, we just concentrate quite heavily on the mode, what it means to make it on time, etc. But we're also trying to get under the skin of why is that important for people. So what is it that is driving levels of behaviour? Is it that they need to feel more safe? That's why they don't choose a certain mode. Is it because they want to be productive on a mode? So really trying to get under the skin, and therefore these sorts of bits of narrative and bits of experimentation for us are really valuable to sort of try and understand if you amplify these, actually do they result in a more sustainable behaviour for an individual. So next slide, please. And I suppose this is just a reflection of why that's quite important. It's a piece of work that we did equally in Coventry around another industrial estate actually, and this was mode agnostic, and we were asking people what drives or what need states are you trying to fulfill in terms of when they consider their commute. So what is driving some of their decisions? So you can see here that time efficiency, convenience and flexibility rules over others, and that explains a lot about why 70% of people chose the car, because for most people it is time efficient and convenient, etc. So the reason for us amplifying or looking at those amplification experience opportunities is that how can we make their sort of end-to-end experience actually something more encompassing and compete with the time efficiency, etc., that is given by the fact your car is on your drive. So this is a really interesting sort of field of sort of behavioural science we're trying to get into here around actually where do you have to go for certain people to amplify their experience enough that they feel value in choosing a different mode. So next slide, please. And this links back to this sort of principle of mobility as a service as well, and equally how mobility as a service, although initially we'll look to focus on modal choice and which is linked to the infrastructure. For an individual, these are likely to be driven by a lifestyle choice, i.e. you are going to work as in a lifestyle, you have to get there. Well, you used to be able to, and as part of that, we really understand how Mars is a lifestyle product linked to transport rather than the transport product. So I think this is a really interesting sort of progression within Mars that we're exploring, recognizing the ecosystem is really, really complex around this, and human behavior is not driven necessarily by the mode, but by the lifestyle. So just a couple of quick slides next on where we've got to with the University of Warwick, if we're able to move on, Janine. So we're sort of partway through this programme. We've been running it now with the university for about sort of 9 to 12 months. We've launched quite a few different things. So demand responsive transport, the car club, the e-scooters, the cycle hire scheme have all launched. We've got a sort of a comms and marketing programme that works with that population. We've got other elements that are looking at doing sort of quantitative research and qualitative research with that population as well, to really get under the skin of why they're doing and behaving in certain ways. So this is really all set up for us for this term coming, whereby we've got that full modal opportunity for people, and we're really sort of excited to see what happens in those sort of 6 months for the first term and second term after Christmas. Next slide, please. And this is something that we're going to use as a bit of a monitoring technique. So with use of Vivacity cameras, which are sort of cameras able to sort of pick out different modes of transport, everything from sort of walking to e-scooters, etc. We're going to put cameras across the site, use all the evidence that we're collecting in terms of data from each of the modes as well, to build effectively a data dashboard. So we can then use that to say, well, if it's raining, what is then happening? What influence does that have on the modal mix locally? If there's an incentive on one type of transport, again, what does that do in terms of the modal mix? So it's going to really give us an insight in terms of the qualitative elements of what's happening, so quantitative elements of what's happening on site. And then we're working with a monitoring evaluation partner and others to do more of the sort of the quantification of some of this, but the why statement. Why are people choosing this? Why are certain demographics using one mode over another? What's driving their levels of behaviour? So it's a really sort of exciting period where we're trying to get and link an individual with the type of journey at the time they're taking it to the mode that's then selected. And as I say, that's a really scalable element for us. And I think on the penultimate slide, then we've just got a bit of what we've learned so far. So as I say, we're really sort of gearing up for September at the moment. We're currently taking analysis of each of the modes, recognising that the period we're in is sort of been altered somewhat by COVID, and also the students have been on and off site, so we're not really getting a true representation, but it's allowed us to sort of scale some of these services and actually understand how they're going to work most effectively come September. And we also recognise that it's going to have to be a rather iterative process as we go back into what is the new world order, and hence why we feel we're rather creating a new baseline for ourselves by sort of focusing in the way that we've done, and that's why the sort of that 6-month period is quite important for us, because that provides a baseline and then a scaling from that position. And I think on the final slide, we've just also got a recognition here around what we need to sort of measure. So not only measuring some of the elements around the services and how they perform, but for any given individual, it's really quite important for us to understand who that individual is, what motivates them, and that's coming from our sort of other elements of FTZ work, the journey type they're going on. So if you're going to work, that produces different needs as if you're going on holiday. So what type of journey are they trying to do? And then equally this element around what is physically available for that individual at the start and the end of their journey. So if the bus is a long way away from your house, you're less likely to take the bus. If a scooter is there, actually, you may be more inclined to take a scooter. So it's really that sort of detailed understanding on an individual basis about what's available. And I think all these things grouped together will really sort of give us some insights about what behaviour is existing and also why. And that's ultimately where we want to get to. And that is the end. So thank you very much, and I'll pass back to Janine.
Thanks, Mark. That was really interesting. Thank you so much for presenting. For me, I know the experience amplifiers are certainly around changing perception of people and businesses to go into that route of mobility service and using the electric side of things. So it is very interesting, and I'll be interested to see how you progress with that. So we are now joined by Saiful Chowdhury. He's a principal engineer from Connected Places Catapult. And over to you, Saiful. Thank you.
Thanks, Janine, and good morning, all. Yeah, so as Janine mentioned, I'm Saiful Chowdhury, a principal engineer in the New Mobility Technologies team at the Connected Places Catapult, and I wanted to talk to you guys about a project that we're working on with DFT around opportunities to exploit cooperative traffic management services. Next slide, please, Janine. So for those of you who don't know or aren't familiar with the catapults, we're essentially a sort of a network of innovation centres across the UK. So there's 9 in total. We exist really to accelerate the UK's capability in innovation. So we work with government, academia, industry, SMEs to help sort of drive that economic growth. So of those 9, we're the Connected Places Catapult, which focuses on the transport sector and the built environment. Next slide, please. Cool. So before we get into sort of what we're doing, it's important to sort of understand why we're doing what we're doing. So this kind of project came about in 2018, I think it was. The DFT published a piece of work called the Local Transport Data Discovery, which looked at local authorities' transport data, the current landscape, and provided a series of recommendations around improving that. So one of the recommendations was around creating a framework and standards for LAs to adopt for implementation of current and future technologies. So that, off the back of that kind of recommendation, we conducted a piece of work with the DFT, which was previously called LAMP, and it's again sort of address that recommendation by providing LAs with information on current tech within the traffic management services sort of sector. Additionally, the DFT also conducted another piece of research called Connected Vehicle Data Research, which was published in 2020. And the CVDR really looked at all of the near-term sort of opportunities for LAs to exploit connected vehicle data and connected vehicle technologies. So the project that we're working on is the Manual for Smart Streets, which seeks to bring these 2 pieces of research and content together into kind of one sort of body of knowledge, which can guide LA's investment into cooperative vehicle technologies. Next slide, please. So with a lot of this future technology, let's say in traffic management services, there's always the question of why is it important now? So as I say, we're looking at near-term opportunity. So in terms of the kind of wider government policy context, it sits within the Build Back Better and levelling up agendas to encourage sort of innovation within LAs and their capability. For future transport zones, is an opportunity to develop and adopt best practice, so it can both feed into what we're doing and learn from what we're doing. it aligns with DFT strategy around delivering cooperative ITS roadside services at scale and moving away from sort of individual pilots, which again lends itself to this sort of concept of FTZs. It also specifically aligns with the DFT data strategy around opening and ensuring future data is open and interoperable, supports digitization and digitalization within local authorities. One of the things that we're looking to do is around supporting the development of an engaged marketplace on the commercial side as well. And also, of course, it will deliver societal benefits in terms of information that is provided and mode choice. Next slide, please, Janine. So what are we doing? So I won't go through all of this, but our goal is essentially to guide the effective and impactful rollout of next-gen traffic management services at scale utilising cooperative connectivity and intelligence, which is a bit of a mouthful, but the key bit being that we're trying to basically lay the foundation that cooperative ITS can be delivered at scale across regions in England. I'll come on to the objectives later on. So if we can go to the next slide, please. So in terms of what we kind of have now, typically local authorities have quite an infrastructure heavy approach to delivery of end user traffic management services. So traditional services do need a lot of heavy infrastructure investment, and it requires the road user to then interact with that investment. So for example, VMS signs, quite costly, expensive things to put on the end of the at the roadside, and then it obviously requires the road user to look at that VMS sign, interpret it, and make a choice based on that information. So we have the different actors within this as well. So you have local authorities using that infrastructure to inform proactive and reactive messaging. Vehicles communicate with the infrastructure so that it can incorporate some of that information which it provides out to end users. So that's kind of what we do now and what we've sort of typically done since kind of the 1980s with the advent of Scoot and signals. So if we go on to the next slide, please, Janine. So in terms of next generation traffic management services, this kind of facilitates this is kind of enabled through a step change in what our approach. So whereas previously we're quite infrastructure heavy, there's an opportunity to become a lot more two-way in terms of using cooperative connectivity and intelligence to have two-way comms between infrastructure, end users, and traffic operations. So here we've got the same basic structure, but your infrastructure will obviously communicate with your vehicles, so using V2I and V2X communications to get much more granular information, potentially improve traffic planning and other consideration for highways authorities and others, local authorities. And it's also an opportunity to push information in terms of notifications and signage to end users rather than them having to pull that information from either VMS or traffic signals or whatever that piece of ITS infrastructure may be. So next slide, please, Janine. So this is just kind of an illustration of that, basically. So on the left, we've got sort of stop-go boards, which are still used today as a traffic management tool. There's a kind of a typical local authority set up in the middle, and some roadside infrastructure there, which are all underpinned by a series of standards and policies and regulations. And what we kind of want to move to is towards the top right, we have some connected vehicle information, so using Glossa and V2X content as well. So we want to move much more towards the cooperative side of traffic management services rather than the kind of traditional stuff that we've got at the moment. So next slide, please. So what are we actually doing and how are we going to go about that? So the Manual for Smart Streets is essentially a toolkit that is going to be published and enable local authorities, or hopefully enable local authorities to make decisions on investment and suppliers to understand the current local authority landscape. So whilst some of the previous work we did on LAMP provided the sort of groundwork for what we're doing now, incorporating some of the stuff that's happened in terms of CVDR, we're looking in particular to incorporate some of the connected vehicle connected V2I and V2X developments, bridge the gaps in our understanding, and also engage with industry and local authorities to inform that. So in particular as well, we will be publishing some of this out online via the Connected Place Catapult website and also via the Transport Technology Forum. But we're seeking to engage with authorities and suppliers who have worked in this field and have interesting stories for us to learn from as well. Yeah, so next slide, please, Janine. So in particular, one of the things that we derived from our previous piece of work was the kind of the steps and the barriers in those steps that exist in terms of tech procurement within local authorities. So we've kind of come up with this sort of 10-step process from defining high-level needs through to decommissioning equipment. In this project, we're broadly focusing on steps 1 to 4, which is around defining the needs through to the specification, and also 6 to 10, so evaluating a tender, and then through to decommissioning. We're not focusing so heavily on the procurement aspects because there's quite a lot of information available, and also your local requirements might be different. So we're keen to ensure that the specifications and all of the information that you need to create a good specification and evaluate a good tender and deliver a good service is available from the content that we deliver, basically. So next slide, please. So yeah, as I mentioned, what we're looking to really do is to guide the rollout of cooperative ITS at scale, and the at scale being the key in this. So this is where it in particular lends itself to future transport zones or regional deployments. What we want to avoid is kind of an inconsistent and siloed approach to delivery of these connected and cooperative traffic management services. So that's broadly what we're trying to get around. I won't go through all of the individual bullets, but we are quite early in our project. We're about 3 months in, and we will wrap up at the end of this year. So there will be opportunities to engage, and it'll be interesting to hear from anybody who has got any interesting feedback in terms of trials and deployments as well. Next slide, please. Yeah, so that was it. So thank you very much. Back over to you, Janine.
Thank you, Saiful. That was great. Certainly look forward to hearing more about Glossa and hearing more about the improved data for traffic planning, so we can lower costs. So it'd be very, very good to get more knowledge around that for sure. So we will be now moving on to our question and answer session. We do have a question and answer box in the top right hand corner. If you do have any questions, we've got about 10 minutes to answer the questions for you. But if there's any questions that come in after this webinar, please feel free to email me and I'll pass them on to the speakers to get an answer for you. So I'm going to hand over now to Julia to just answer those questions for you. Over to you, Julia. Thank you.
Thank you everyone for the presentations. So as we have got only 10 minutes, I'll probably fit one question per speaker. So I will start with Conrad, and I would like to ask you if you've got any understanding of emissions associated with drones in comparison to the equivalent done via traditional road freight. You're on mute, Conrad.
Apologies. I went to my second screen thinking it was a touch screen. So it's not specifically part of our project, but we have looked at it a little bit. It's not a very good comparison in the Solent because, as you saw from the map, road freight isn't really a problem that it isn't really the problem we're trying to solve, because we have both road and sea freight, and it's about the logistics. So one, sort of sea ferries are more polluting than HGVs. They just are. But there's an element here of sort of the amount of distance that a vehicle would have to carry to travel, because it's quite small distances directly, but by road and ferry it's significantly further as well. So it's not specifically a part of the project that we're looking at, but in reality, some of the things that we are looking to carry would be things that you would have to send an helicopter for. So the comparison with road freight isn't probably the one that we would look at anyway. It would be, how would we have to carry these things if we had to carry them quickly? There's also the consideration of some of the things we will be doing will be stopping people making journeys, because if we can get multiple pieces of medical sort of drugs to the Isle of Wight hospital, residents of the Isle of Wight won't have to go to Portsmouth or Southampton, which could be a significant amount of journey for them, and would not be in some places particularly practical. So it was a very complicated, it's a good question, a very good question, but it's a very complicated question to ask, to answer, and there's a lot more in the mix than just how much would this cost to travel, the environment to travel by HGV.
Thank you. Next question from Mark. How does the journey preference data behave when you split it into rural and urban areas?
So it's again a good question. I think we've not necessarily got a definitive answer yet, but what I will point to is effectively the things that we are doing that allow us to answer it. So if anyone knows anything about the geography of University of Warwick, effectively it sits on the outskirts of Coventry. So you've got an urban sort of centre to the north in Coventry, you've got a rural area to the sort of the west and the east, and then there's also a town of Kenilworth to the south. So what we've concentrated our services specifically with a radius of up to 10 miles from that sort of centre of the university to cover that sort of difference in space. And we know from the university data where everybody is largely, the commuting traffic is coming from, so students and staff, and they're our sort of main focus. And as part of our monitoring evaluation, we are working with that staff and also doing in-depth travel diaries with selected members of staff as well, to understand some of that sort of behaviour, as well as trying to map this idea around who they are, what journey types are they doing, most of their commuting journeys, but not always, and also the availability of services across the patch. With that data and all the other information we've got around services, we will be able to plot quite an individualistic view of what travel preferences exist from where they are sort of coming from and going to. So although we don't have that specific data available to ourselves and that sort of conclusions yet, we will be able to get it because of that sort of mix and also the monitoring exercise that we've got in place. So hopefully that sort of half answers your question. It's maybe one to re-ask in about 6 months' time.
Thank you. And I'll go to Saiful next. So a question for you. Is there an opportunity here for other infrastructure hookup before the scope of LA owned? beyond the scope of LA owned?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. So potentially there is scope, yes. So it depends on what the technology and service is. The guidance is aimed at local authorities, but obviously there's lots of inputs in terms of tech and data. So it might not just be their owned infrastructure. It might be that data that they're receiving from, for example, crowdsourced apps or anything like that will feed into what we're talking about. So there is scope, and it just depends on the type of technology or service we're talking about, essentially.
Thank you. Do we have time for one more question per speaker, Janine?
We have, yeah, one. Yeah.
So next question for Conrad, please. I wondered whether Solent Transport looked at other examples of where medical supplies were being delivered by drones before undertaking the project. I know that Rwanda is doing this for delivery of key medical products, including blood and organs.
Yes, and this time with off mute. So I'll try my 3 or 4 minute answer. So the really quick answer to that is yes, we did. And in fact, the Ultracraft, the really big drone that we used for the first one, was designed specifically for that. And this was great. This is one of the great findings we had. I mean, we just unearthed findings time and time again during that project. It was just so useful. But what we understood is that Solent's very different from Rwanda. I mean, today, the Solent's probably got very similar weather to Rwanda, but it's not normal. You're looking at a large sort of piece of land, but quite significant distances, and also cutting out big pieces of that journey that are fairly impractical, and being able to do it quickly was really important to Rwanda. But it's a short hop. It's a complicated short hop. It's a short hop. So the indirect nature of having to use something that needed a sort of runway was sort of a disadvantage in Solent, and it made complications around several other things, including logistics and the labour chain as well, of who we had to have on the project, how many people we had to have, people loading and unloading who were qualified to do it on certain vehicles. And as you got into sort of categorized cargoes, that became even more complicated. So yes, we did. We looked, we learned, and then learned that actually in different environments, different rules apply, and the rules for the CAA as well, as I'm sure that Julia and your team will vouch, are much different to the ones that are in Rwanda. Not saying that the ones in Rwanda are worse in any way, shape, or form, but the CAA are quite. They're really keen to progress this, but they are not quite there. We were breaking a lot of new ground for them, and they're quite cautious in the breaking of that. So I think that there were quite a few considerations that apply here and apply to the geography of Solent that don't apply elsewhere.
Thank you. I'll ask a very quick question to Mark, if you can keep it very short. So the question is, are you monitoring the number of electric and hybrid cars privately owned in the project? And have you seen any increased or shift?
So yes is the answer to the first bit of that question. So we will be. There's also a salary sacrifice scheme that the university are introducing for purchase of electric vehicles, and the university are introducing ANPR on site, so we can do some active management. That will be from September, October this year. So we haven't necessarily got the sort of the answer yet. It's going to be within the next sort of 6 to 8 months, but it is something as part of the programme that we will monitor, because that's part of it. Yeah.
Thank you. And last very quick question to Saiful. Do you see any benefit to vulnerable road users in next generation traffic management systems, and what are these? How are you planning to enhance such benefits?
So we have a use case on vulnerable road users, which we'll get into in a little bit more detail. We haven't gone through all of the exact benefits yet, so that will come as part of the project, but we see that there's probably a few areas more in terms of strategy setting for vulnerable road user safety based on the data that we capture. So we'll go through that in more detail, but that will be part of the use cases that we create.
Thank you. So for any question we've missed, we'll make sure to get back to you in writing, and I'll pass back to Janine for our thank you and close. And you're on mute, Janine.
Thank you, Julia, and thank you, speakers, for providing such a lovely 3 presentations, really useful, really beneficial for our knowledge. So if anyone does want to ask any questions post-webinar, I know there's quite a few of you that have messaged me that really wanted to attend and was unable to, and anyone that actually is registered and then couldn't get through, I will be there for you to answer any questions, and I will get my speakers to answer them for you and get back to you. The presentation deck will be shared along with the recording. I hope you've all enjoyed the webinar. Enjoy this lovely, warm, hot day and take care, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.